On the morning of February the 14th, 1945, 74-year-old Charles Walton put his walking stick to one side, ignored the nagging ache from his rheumatic joints, and set off for work. On this particular day, he had been hired to cut back the hedging at the first farm on the lower slopes of Meon Hill in Warwickshire. He took his own tools with him, that consisted of a hay fork and a trouncing tool. Charles's niece, Edith, who he had adopted as a child when her parents had died, waved goodbye to her uncle before finishing her household duties and setting off for work herself. That evening, 33-year-old Edith's fears started to grow when her uncle failed to return home at his usual time. She waited, but after some time had passed, a worried Edith went looking for help in locating her uncle. She knocked on friend and neighbour, 72-year-old Harry Beasley's door. Edith told him how worried she was that Charles hadn't come home, and they both went up to the farm where they knew Charles was working. Alfred Potter, who owned the farm, told them he wasn't there, but he thought he had seen him earlier that day, as he saw a man he presumed was Charles cutting the hedges. The day had turned to darkness as the February night drew in. A concerned Edith, Harry and Alfred Potter went in search of the missing Charles by torchlight. They hiked up the hill to where Charles had last been seen, and it didn't take long before they came across someone lying in the road. What they saw wasn't just horrific, it was extremely brutal. Charles lay covered in blood. He'd been brutally murdered. His pitchfork prongs were embedded into his neck, and his trouncing hook lay beside him where it had been dropped after slashing his neck. His arms looked as though they were cut and bleeding from defence wounds. Looking closer, they allegedly noticed a cross had been engraved into his chest. Now this is debatable, as the coroner didn't include this in his report, so it's possibly been made up to suit the storyline. Once the police had been informed of this terrible murder, they secured the scene. The attack on Charles was so brutal it took 2 officers to remove the pitchfork. Charles's body was then taken carefully down to the village of Lower Quinton. Superintendent Alex Spooner of the Warwickshire CID took charge of the case. He hadn't seen anything like this before, and while the officers took photos and statements at the crime scene, he, while pondering the strange circumstances of Charles's death, had been directed to a book on folklore. For many, where folklore was concerned, these parts of the Cotswolds had always been steeped in mystery and superstitions. It was a place where the people had been tormented by the devil, and Celtic kings wandered the hills with their black hounds. Witches' covens, many believed, were rife around this area, and rumours started to spread that Charles was a member of one of these covens. It seems Charles's knowledge of the old country law was quite extensive, and some of his eccentricities had led people to have some suspicions about him. He had been a little eccentric and a bit of a loner, but it seemed he was well liked. Detective Superintendent Robert Fabian, the most famous police officer of the day, and his assistant Sergeant Albert Webb travelled up from London's Scotland Yard, after they had been requested by the Deputy Chief Constable of Warwickshire, who believed they had a maniac on the loose. He had also stated that Dr. Webster had given the police his early results, that Charles Walton had been killed between 1 and 2 p.m, and the only thing missing from his possessions was a metal pocket watch. An incident room was set up in Stratford-upon-Avon, and Fabian and Webb coordinated with Detective Spooner. One of the first things Fabian did was to have the entire crime scene thoroughly searched. As RAF Leamington Spa was close by, they had one of their planes fly over the area to take aerial photos of the crime scene. They then, with help from the Royal Engineers, used mine detectors to do a ground search, hoping to find the pocket watch that was missing, as there may be fingerprints on the metal casing. Unfortunately, they didn't find anything. Spooner offered up his findings from a book by J. Harvey Bloom regarding witchcraft and folklore. He told the 2 men from Scotland Yard that in 1875 a young man killed an old woman called Anne Turner with a hay fork because he believed she had put a spell on him. the man named John Haywood vowed to kill all 16 witches he believed lived in Long Compton. Fabian and Webb looked bemused at Spooner, telling him he had been in the countryside too long. Spooner, unfazed, laughed and said, "You'll soon see for yourselves." Fabian had a murder map placed on the HQ wall, and the pictures from the aerial shots was placed there too. They traced the path Charles had taken that day and would compare the suspect's tracks when they could. D.S. Saunders of the Special Branch, who could speak the languages they needed, was tasked with the question of the prisoners of war that were held in the camp close by at Long Marsden. 1,043 Italian, German and Ukrainian prisoners were questioned. Fabian and Webb questioned the villagers. They interviewed over 400 people, not just from the village, but those who had visited that day from other areas. D.S. Saunders soon had a suspect. An Italian man had been seen washing blood from his hands and clothes near the murder scene. Finding his blood-stained coat, it was sent straight to the lab to check it against a sample of Charles's blood. They checked the area the Italian man had been seen, which was very close to the murder scene, and once again used mine detectors to see if they could locate the pocket watch. But all they found was animal traps placed there by the man to catch rabbits. They then heard from the lab that the blood on the Italian man's coat didn't match Charles's. It was rabbit's blood. The man had been poaching. There had also been boot prints in the mud at the scene, and casts had been made of the prints, so they tested everyone's boots, the entire village and surrounding villages, including the POW camp, but nothing. After an exhaustive investigation, they were unfortunately getting nowhere. To make matters worse, the villagers went quiet and refused to talk anymore. Why was this? Probably because they had nothing more to say. In Fabian's own words, they hadn't seen anything, and therefore they had nothing to tell. Should they at least take a look at the witchcraft theory? It's been rumoured the police did study the books Spooner had told them about. If they did, they would have read the stories of witchcraft and folklore of the area. Could it give them some insight into the murderer? It was apparently thought that if you killed the person who had cast a spell on you and engraved a cross on their body, the spell would be broken. It's claimed there is a passage in the book regarding a man also called Charles Walton, who died in 1885. He's said to have been tormented by a foreboding ghost and had visions of a large black dog chasing him. Was there any similarities with Charles's murder? Could it possibly be linked with someone practicing witchcraft? Obviously, they didn't believe witchcraft was responsible. But it was possible someone did believe in it and carried out the murder believing Charles Walton was somehow responsible for, well, something unknown to them, as they certainly couldn't find a motive. The police had taken over 4,000 statements and exhausted all avenues, but they were getting nowhere. After a month, a defeated Fabian and Webb returned to Scotland Yard. But Fabian did have a prime suspect, the farm owner Alfred Potter, who Charles had gone to work for that day. Potter had known Charles for around 5 years and often employed him to trim back the hedges. When Potter was interviewed twice, the interviewing officers remarked on how nervous he was. He had mentioned seeing someone he thought to be Charles after visiting the local pub that afternoon. He had seen the person standing in the field close to where Charles had been working. He was in shirt sleeves, so he just presumed it was Charles. It had been noted that the hedge Charles had been working on had been started but not finished. It had also been discovered that Charles had been wearing a sleeveless shirt, so the man Potter had allegedly seen couldn't have been Charles. It was only when they told they would be testing the murder weapons for fingerprints that Potter mentioned he had touched them when they had found Charles to check if he was dead. And Potter was also left alone with Charles's body while someone was sent to fetch the police, and Edith was escorted back to the cottage. Potter's statements matched those of his alibis, but there were some discrepancies. Potter himself claimed to have seen Charles at around 12:20 p.m. Potter's wife saw her husband at 12:40 p.m. after which he had gone to help one of his employees, and while out they had noted the church clock and it was 1 p.m. It would come to light that Potter had said on the 17th of February that he'd gone to retrieve a drowned heifer from a ditch just after 12:40 p.m. on the 14th, when his wife said she had seen him, but it wasn't retrieved until 3:30 p.m. And on the 23rd of February, in his statement, he claimed to have gone home, read a paper, then went to help his employee, Charles Batchelor, to pulp mangolds. It seemed obvious to Fabian that Potter was lying about his actions at those crucial times, but it was all just conjecture at that time. They needed something more solid. Harry Beasley claimed it was obvious when they found Charles that he was dead, and he hadn't seen Potter check Charles at all, and hadn't seen him touch the weapons, dispelling Potter's claims he had touched the tools while checking to see if Charles was dead. Some small stains on Potter's trousers Fabian thought could have been blood were sent to the lab, but the clothing had been washed so well an analysis couldn't be made. Potter also commented that he believed that one of the prisoners from the camp was responsible, as one had been found stealing earlier that week. Apparently he was rather excited about this revelation. Fabian delved into Potter's life, looking for a motive, but the man was clean. He found nothing to incriminate him. Adding fuel to Fabian's fire was when he found out some employees of Potter's had resigned after the murder, one of them being Batchelor. They had no proof at all. No pocket watch and no fingerprints were found. Fabian had to admit he couldn't find any real evidence to connect Potter to the murder. Word of the strange and brutal murder would spread and became a talking point around the country, leading to sensational headlines and curious minds wondering who or why would someone kill and disfigure an old man in such a grotesque way. Many believed the story that Charles Walton was a witch who had cast a spell that would cause the crops to fail and farm stock to die. So his death, they believed, was a ritualistic killing where his blood was spilled to replenish the soil. It was also rumoured that Charles's pocket watch was found later in 1960 when some buildings behind his cottage were demolished. When opened, a piece of glass fell out. This was believed to be a witch's glass that was carried around with him everywhere he went. The purpose of this was to deflect evil thoughts away from the person carrying it. Detective Inspector Spooner continued to visit Lower Quinton. He remained convinced the killer was local. Every year on the anniversary of Charles's murder, he would visit the site where Charles was found, and remained hopeful that one day the killer would be found. Charles Walton's murder was never solved, and the case remains open. Thank you for watching.